So this morning, we're looking at 2 Samuel 13, 23 through 39 as we continue our study through the books of Samuel. We've been in these two books for a long time, more than a year, but it's taught us a lot. And you know what struck me is, and I'd read all the way through both of them before several times, but what struck me is as so on point is that everything that's addressed in the New Testament is pretty much addressed in these books. That's right. From one way to the other. It's that you have a personal story of different people in here, and the story of a nation, specifically the story of the leadership of a nation and how it succeeded and how it failed. But at the same time, we answer all these questions about things like patience and hate and love, endurance. In this case, we're talking about vengeance. In this morning, in Sunday school, we talked about anger and how you manage anger and what the consequences of not managing it is, and how some people, there's a couple of types of anger. There's a hothead type, and people that get mad immediately and then they kind of get over it, and then you have the type that smolders and goes on for days, and none of those are great. But the big consequence of anger in many cases is vengeance. It's you get mad at somebody, and then you want to get even with them. I mean, that's the way it works, and that's the kind of thing that we have to quell. This story here is about how it wasn't quailed, how it took its course, and how it destroyed people. And I think that's a lesson we got to learn from this. So hopefully it'll make us think that, when we do get mad, which is going to happen, that we keep our mouth shut till we get over it, number one. And number two, that we don't try to take vengeance, because sometimes vengeance is not beating up somebody or hurting them. It's doing other more subtle things, gossiping about them, talking behind their back, not being nice to them. There's lots of ways to seek vengeance. But Psalm 94:1 said, "O Lord, God of vengeance, O God of vengeance, shine forth." Psalm 94:1. And that's a prayer about how God's kingdom will eventually come and replace all these bad emotions, these bad things that we have in us, and take us to a place where God is in charge of vengeance. Now, we're not saying God's going to take away vengeance. God's not going to take away vengeance. God's going to do vengeance. That's what God does. And a lot of that offends some modern sensibilities. They think, well, God's just a God of love. He should never be angry or take vengeance. But I think it's a wonderful thing that, when we have enemies and we know they're against God, they're against us, that God will take vengeance on them. It's not our deal to take vengeance, it's theirs. We're not good at taking vengeance. We're not good at paying things back. If we took vengeance on someone who angered us or did us wrong, we'd probably overdo it. We'd probably make it worse than it is, and then it'd come back on us, and that spirals down till it really gets bad. But no one really wants a world where wickedness and bad things go unpunished. Even criminals know that there's worse criminals than they are. I've heard it. I've seen interviews of people in prison where they're in prison for bank robbery, but they're not going to put up with someone who's a child molester. They're both sins, but we all consider something worse than what we do, and so we suffer from that. We suffer from being unable to do it properly, and like I said a while ago, sometimes the punishment is just like, I'm not going to notice them. I'm not going to speak to them. In this case, we had someone who went 2 years without speaking to their brother and then killed him. Not good. But one reason that God's provided the world with governing authorities, government, we talk about government all the time and how bad it is, and it can be bad. But what if we didn't have any at all? You know, we've talked about this before. What if our government was like North Korea's? And you think, well, that couldn't get any worse. But just think if North Korea had no government at all. What would it have? The human nature is to form groups and to have leaderships over those groups. So if you didn't have a national government, you'd probably have a bunch of small governments all battling against each other. That's why when the United States was settled by white people, that they were able to overcome the people already living here, is because all those people had hundreds of governments and they couldn't work together. Otherwise, we'd have never made it. So it's easy to see that we have to have government. At the same time, it's easy to see that that government can be corrupt and it can be bad. And it's most of the time, it's not all good, put it like that. Most of the time, because people who seek leadership roles, in a lot of cases, tend to be looking out for self. So God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord, Romans 12:19. And Paul here is citing Deuteronomy 32:35. And there's other passages in Thessalonians and Hebrews that talk about this too. So we believe that God said he would take vengeance on our enemies. We believe that. And if you believe that, then you don't have to do it yourself. So David's kingdom here suffered the consequence of his sinfulness, his adultery. He took this woman and then he had his wife murdered, or her husband murdered. And so David's son Amnon followed in his footsteps and raped his sister Tamar against her will. And that's what we looked at last week. And so the problem of vengeance here was raised and what was to be done. And of course, for 2 years, according to the script, nothing was done. Tamar lived as a desolate woman in her other brother Absalom's house, and she's never mentioned again. We don't know what happened with her. We know she probably lived the rest of her life alone and desolate because she was shamed by her brother. So one evil breeds another. And so here we see what Absalom, the other brother, did after 2 years of waiting, according to verse 23, how his vengeance, although it was accomplished, solved nothing. In fact, it just made things worse. So we see here a summary of the incident. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers from Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons, verse 23. So he invited the whole family, and by this time David's got several sons by several different women. We don't know what happened during those 2 years that he was waiting, but can you just see it? Every day he gets up, he goes and has breakfast, and there sits his sister. And he starts thinking about it. And maybe they talk about it, I don't know. But it keeps building up. It keeps seething and boiling like a cauldron. And after 2 years, he's figured out what he's going to do. So this took place about 15 miles northeast of Jerusalem, near the town of Baal Hazor. And the occasion was the annual sheep shearing. You know, when they raise sheep, every year there's a certain time that they take the wool off and sell it, and that's what they did. And it's kind of like a roundup. You know, they get all the animals together and they spend several days doing this thing. So it's kind of a festival, like too, you know, in the Old Testament. So it's been 2 years. It seems like happy days are here. All the Absalom's getting everybody together. He mentions all the sons of David, all his brothers, and he's been biding his time. So he approaches his father, the king, suggesting that this year's feast be a big one. And Absalom came to the king and said, Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. Verse 24. So he's saying, bring the whole family, bring the whole court, come out here and we'll have a big party. Bring everybody. And the king said to Absalom, No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you. In other words, it'd be too much to do all this. You're going to have all the expense of having to deal with the king, having to deal with his court. It's probably going to cost a lot more than just taking some sheep shearers out. So he didn't really reject him totally, but I suspect David didn't fully trust Absalom at that point either. But he persisted. He pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Verse 25b. So Absalom gives him the impression that he wants everybody out there, knowing David probably wouldn't be willing to go. So now he offers a compromise. Then Absalom said, If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. Now David knows what Amnon did. It made him angry, but he didn't do anything. This happens frequently with kids. Parents get angry, they don't take no action. So it goes on to get even worse. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. That's why our streets are full of angry young people. That's to a large extent. Between that and the indoctrination they get in colleges, that's why our streets are full of these people. And this Absalom was treated basically the same way. He said, If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. Now we know that Amnon did this horrible crime, and we know that Absalom hated him for it. And David probably knew this. And yet he falls into this trap. And we got to remind ourselves that Amnon is the crown prince. Amnon is the guy next in line to take David's throne. We know he never takes it, but we know that he is in line for it. So you'd think David would be wanting to protect him in more ways than one, but David couldn't have forgotten what he'd done. And here is Absalom hadn't spoke to him for 2 full years, and the king said, Why should he go with you? Verse 26. Not exactly a refusal, but why should he allow him access to it? But Absalom pressed him, verse 27. And he said, Amnon and all the king's sons with him, verse 27b. So David relents here. He don't take his court. He don't take the rest of the family, but he sent all his sons out there. He's taking a chance, but he does. Kind of a compromise, but at the same time, David apparently feels like it's safe to do that. Amnon duped David into sending Tamar to him. You remember he was sick, or pretended to be sick. He was in his bedroom, said, Let her come break bread for me and feed it out of her hand, and then he took advantage of her. And then after taking advantage of her, he hated her and kicked her out. David allowed that to happen, and he was very angry after it happened. But if you remember back in David's earlier life, whenever David was very angry, he usually took action. And people usually didn't live because of it. But in this case, he didn't, because it was his son. So the king actually sent Amnon over to this sheep shearing. And you need to remember, too, that these sons represent David's house. Not just a house in the sense of a house, but a dynasty. They're the future. As our people, our sons are our future, our sons and daughters. So before the guest arrived, Absalom calls his own servants together and issued his instructions. Then Absalom commanded his servants, Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Verses 28. Y'all recognize that? It's what God said to Joshua, pretty much, when they were getting ready to invade Canaan. So Absalom obviously feels righteous about this. He feels like it's his right to seek vengeance. But Paul says it's not right to seek vengeance. And we'll see here that it's not going to do him any good. Strike him and then kill him. Do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Very similar to Joshua 1:9. So, and he also acts here like he's a commander of troops, like he's got the right to do this, like he's at war. Listen for my signal and then kill him. And not only is he going to accept responsibility for it, he's going to act like it was just a good thing that he's doing. And in his own mind, it probably was. You know, in his own mind, he's doing what the king refused to do. He's taking on the responsibilities of the king, and we'll see later on that goes wrong too. We'll see that. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. They get the boy drunk. They're having a party here, sharing the sheep. They get him drunk and they stab him and kill him right there. So the sins of the father fall on the sins of the son. The sins of the son replicate the sins of the father. So you can imagine this bloody scene. All who witnessed it were terrified because they're thinking, I'm next. So all these king's sons arose, each one mounted his mule and fled. They all took off because they were worried it could be a massacre. As the king's sons were fleeing from Baal Hazor, and before they arrived safely back in Jerusalem, we go back to the capital and we see what's going on there. While they were on the way, news came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons and not one of them is left. So how did this rumor get there? You know, these boys got on these mules and took off toward Jerusalem. How did the rumor get there before they did? There weren't no cell phones or telegraphs or any of that stuff at the time. So obviously there was something going on before it happened. Somebody knew what was going to happen, and it started this rumor around the palace. So that's something to think about. Gossip, you know, like a lot of gossip, it sounded more authoritative than it was. And a lot of times people who gossip claim to know a lot more than they actually do, to kind of pump it up a little bit. So here, not one of them is left, verse 30. That's kind of the thing somebody says about an overwhelming war. But Absalom, his personal ambitions were probably known around the palace. Can you imagine if you lived in a big palace? Just imagine, a contemporary illustration would be Buckingham Palace, of course. Just think of, you got the Queen and some of her family living there, but most of the people living there are servants and workers and staff, secretaries and people like that. They're government employees. And you got probably 100 of them living in that palace. Well, David's palace would have been similar. The word is kind of like people that work together. They feed each other information. So that's probably what was happening here. So someone had guessed that Absalom had brought all these brothers over to the sheep shearing to kill them all. And David immediately believed it. He didn't even check it out. Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth. And all his servants who were standing by tore their garments. So David believed it immediately. He must have had suspicions when he said, why should he go with you, back in verse 26. These servants were just as ready as the king to believe this, because they'd probably already heard it. There's a gossip was going around. Now, there was one guy who wasn't caught up in all this, and his name is Jonadab. Jonadab was David's brother's son, and he was the son of Shemiah, David's brother. Let not my lord suppose that they've killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king so take it to heart as to suppose that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon alone is dead. Verses 32 and 33. So here this is the same guy that arranged for and come up with the idea for Amnon to get Tamar back in his bedroom. Set that whole thing up. He is working behind the scenes, and apparently he's already went over to Absalom, and he's arranging things for him now. So he helps one brother commit this terrible sin and this terrible crime, and then he turns around and he's helping another brother take vengeance. It's the only way he could have known all this. So he puts a little positive spin on it. They're not all dead, just one. Just one, and he deserves it. It does reveal that Jonadab knew of his intentions all along. So then we're taken back to Baal Hazor, and we're informed that Absalom fled. He probably fled immediately after this happened. He didn't flee with all the king's sons. They all headed back to Jerusalem, but he fled in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, a young man was on lookout duty, saw an approaching but yet unidentifiable crowd. And the young man who kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. Jonadab knew who they were. And Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come, as your servant said, so it has come about. I'm right. They're all coming back. They're all alive. All but Amnon. And as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very bitterly. So you got grief here for Amnon, but probably grief of joy that the rest of them aren't dead either. But his firstborn son is dead. All this goes back to what God said after he had this Uriah the Hittite murdered. It's coming around on this family. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammiud, king of Geshur. So Talmai was Absalom's maternal grandfather, and his kingdom of Geshur was east of the Jordan River and to the north, out of David's kingdom. It wasn't part of David's kingdom. And meanwhile, David mourned for his son day after day, verse 37b. And he actually mourned for his son the rest of his life. And he mourned for more than one of his sons, as we're going to see. So Absalom's time in Geshur was shorter than David's in mourning, but it was long enough. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And what will happen after those 3 years is what we're going to look at through the rest of 2 Samuel. And the chapter closes with kind of a difficult verse. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. Verse 39. You remember how David grieved and prayed to the Lord when he was told that his son would die, the young boy, the baby that Bathsheba had. How after the baby died, he got up and ate, washed his face, and kind of got over it. It's sort of the same thing here. They say that the Hebrew is kind of ambiguous. We don't know. It doesn't seem to indicate that he's longing for Absalom, but he's comforted that Amnon, in a way that Amnon, since he's dead, he can't do anything about it. So he's kind of accepting it there. But he took no action against him when he had raped his sister, and he worried about sending him to this feast, but he did it anyway. And so now he's to the point where there's not anything he can do at the moment. So here we see the shortcomings of David's kingdom. We've seen a lot of the strengths of David's kingdom, and we'll probably see more, but we're going to see more shortcomings too. And it all shadows what happens in all societies and in all governments, and what's happening in ours right now. You know, It shadows that. It shows that, to me, it proves that, you know, you hear people talk about evolution. Well, the human being has not evolved any, not since then. I think maybe he's devolved some. But we're no better than we ever were. You know, since the garden, this is how we've been. So this kind of tells us how it was 5,000 years ago is not much different than it is now. And so when we pray, your kingdom come in Matthew 6:10, we're praying that God's going to come and fix it all. And that God's going to take vengeance on our enemies. And we can be comforted with that because we shouldn't be doing it. We're not going to do a very good job, but he will. Vengeance on those who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. 2 Thessalonians 1:8. So when you pray for the kingdom, you're praying for vengeance. And that's a good thing because it's God's vengeance. If y'all come up, we'll do communion. And after we do communion,